Greetings to everyone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Bodan Syroyid, and I'm doctor and professor of music education and a composer and music analyst. Today we'll be looking at a composition of my own that was based on Bach's cello suite, for which we'll be doing a little bit of analysis of these two pieces. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank everyone who has been subscribing to this channel, so I'd like to invite you to do this. If you are finding this information useful, as I've said in previous videos, the whole point of the channel is to provide with educational materials for my current composition students, where I explain the basic core techniques of composition, and also I'll be in the future videos showing some of the students' work. In today's video, we'll be focusing on my own piece, so that's why I have here a separate score of it. And it was basically an improvisation that, if I remember correctly, was done 2 years ago in 10 December 2022. And what we'll be looking at is on how this piece was built from Bach's cello suite. Right, so without further ado, we'll start listening a little bit to the opening bars of Bach's piece. So probably you have heard this multiple times. There are very famous recordings of this prelude, and it has become one of the most iconic pieces by Bach. Of course, the entire background behind how this piece was written still remains a little bit unclear. It comes with a set of 6 suites that are very unique in writing and very sophisticated. And the first prelude, which just occupies these 2 pages, is probably one of the most famous pieces ever written for the instrument. And of course, here I'm playing it on the piano, but the harmonic principles that we see in this prelude that opens the G major suite are quite relatable or quite similar to the C major prelude of the Well-Tempered Clavier, which sounds like this. As a matter of fact, these 2 pieces, in spite of being in different keys, one is in C major, the prelude for piano, the cello prelude is in G major, share a lot of commonalities. The harmonic progression is almost identical for the first 13-15 bars. And then what we see is this flow of 16th notes that becomes the pattern that dominates the texture. We have a 4/4 time signature. And of course, in this case, the writing of the cello part is much more melodic, and it's based partially on arpeggios, but also on scales, which allows Bach to create a quite unique sonority. So the first thing that we need to know is, with this introduction, is to know what a prelude is and what is its role in the suite. So generally speaking, preludes are pieces that are written for introducing something. In this case, we're presenting a suite, which is a set of dances. As we can see, the next piece is an allemande, right? This is a 4-meter dance. Courant is 3/4. And then you have a slow dance sarabande, and then it follows with a minuet and a fast gig. So this suite is being introduced by a prelude that has as its main role first to present the main key, which is G major in this case, and also kind of produce or anticipate the mood of the listener for what's going to happen. Traditionally, preludes prior to Bach were mostly focused around the concept of improvisation, and they didn't have to be necessarily very long in scope, right? In the case of Bach, Bach is perfecting the prelude form. Here he achieves a 42 measure piece that, well, as of its own, it makes a good stand and has a great sonority, and it usually is also performed without the suite. So that's something quite symbolic, because the piece was just initially designed to be just an introduction. Another interesting factor is that Bach, within the lineage of composers in Western music, is usually considered like the great master of counterpoint. And in this piece, we're not starting with a fugue, which we might be doing in another video. But in this case, we're just looking at something that's monophonic. So monophony is when you're only having one single voice, one note at a time. But even within this monophony, which is the monophonic texture of one note at a time, Bach is achieving masterfully to create separate parts. And he is, by doing so, creating this chorale feel in developing all of these inner movements. Now, that's what we need to know as a background. Now, how are preludes written? Because to write a prelude, we need to now have some foundation. So generally speaking, there are multiple theories about a prelude form, but the one that I like to use, and I think is the simplest for my students to understand, is when we think of the prelude as a set of expositions followed by transitions. That means that we're presenting one key and we're transitioning or modulating to another key. And every time that that happens, we usually will have a perfect cadence. So to put it here more clearly, we are having an opening, which will give yellow. This is the opening part. And that works partially as an exposition, because all it does is to state the G major key. Right? If we analyze it harmonically, we might find that it's doing 1, you have 4, with second inversion, you have the dominant 7th, and back to 1. Right? That one actually is a major one. So that exposition is a very clear chord progression that we see in multiple pieces by Bach. 1, 4, 5, 1. Can be now repeated after a series of modulations in another key or in the same key, right? In this case, Brahms is clearly doing it another time here. So if we look at this section, what we're seeing is again the same chord progression. Right? So it's a 1. In this case, this one is a secondary dominant. So I put an asterisk. This is the equivalent of dominant of the 4th. Then you have the 4th, which is here inverted, the dominant as such, and the tonic. And this is the second exposition. So exposition expo 2, G major 2. In many pieces by Bach or preludes, also this applies to concerto forms, the expositions change in terms of keys, right? So far in this case, where we're seeing that he stays in exposition 1 and 2 in the same key. This same form applies also to other forms like inventions, right? So in inventions, you can see this. And also it applies to fugues, because in fugues, you're seeing expositions and divertimentos, which are these modulation sections. Right, so the next job is to keep looking and see if we can find another exposition. And the only one that we find is this one at the end, right? So it's the third exposition, again in G major, expose 3, G major, and it's doing the exact same chord progression. Well, we're having, well, it's slightly different because it's doing 1, an inversion, then you have a dominant 7th, or actually a dominant sus4. That's the main difference. Then you have a dominant 7th, and it leads to tonic, right? Speaking of which, well, that's kind of like the overall structure. This is the climactic point. And it's also a particularly interesting thing because what we have is firstly a dominant pedal point, and then we're having also an inversion, right? So Bach is inverting the original pattern that was going upwards, now it's going downwards. And this was a tonic pedal point. Tonic pedal point that's defined by that G that's staying all the way through. So we have it there. And highlight those G's. Whereas the second time, it's rather than the G, we can see the D in the bass. Right, and the D as a pedal point is something that basically is the definition of the second part. So this dominant pedal point, it's something that's really developed throughout. I mean, we can find here these elements, but what are all of these different sections are, they're just, well, these transitions or developments, and there are only two of them. So the first one is appearing here. This is the first transition. Transition 1. When they're this long, I actually like to call them developments. Right, so we have a development. And transition 2 is happening here, which is the second development. Now, the second development clearly is larger, and it also arrives to a climactic point. So we have here the climax, it's that resolution at the end. So let's briefly comment what they do. Harmonically, this is kind of similar to what we see in the C major Prelude by Bach, although in that case, the second exposition is in a different key. So that's kind of a remarkable difference. Right. Firstly, we can see that in the development, the concept of the pattern that was always repeated is looser. So now everything is moving around. Right, we don't have that repeated bass with every 2 beats. And harmonically, there are also accidentals, right? So let's analyze this harmonically briefly. We have the 6th degree of G, which is the equivalent of the 2nd degree of D major, right? I'm talking specifically about the chord of E minor, right? That's the chord that we're having there. That goes to D major, so we're now start looking from D major, and in D major I'm having this dominant 7th of D major, and that goes to tonic 1. After that, Bach continues moving, so we're still having this 2, 5, 1. He's doing that twice, and then things keep moving. So we're having this diminished chord, which is technically the dominant of the 2nd degree, right? We're being in the key of G major, and in the key of D major, that would be the dominant of the dominant. It's going to A minor, right? So that's the 2nd degree. And here we have the dominant of the 6th degree, E minor, and that's the 6th degree that eventually resolves to the dominant, right? All of this was seen from the key of G major. And you might be wondering, how do we connect this? Well, this 1 in D major, this is tonic, and it's the same as a dominant in the key of G major. So it's the same as 5, right? That type of equivalent modulation is what we have here. It works like a little pivot chord, same as that chord was working there. Probably for sake of consistency, I'll do 1 of D. I'll put equal to 5 of G. And from this point onward, I'll put that we're in D major key. So we're in D major, and in D major, we're starting to analyze this as dominant, right? What is happening here is quite straightforward. So it's a progression in which Bach goes to the dominant. He's modulating to the dominant. That's the main point of the development. And then he's returning back. So how is that modulation happening? You have this E minor chord that goes to 5-1, and then E minor again, and 5-1. I'll play it. 5, 1, that's the E minor again, 5, and 1. And what's really beautiful about this is that in spite of doing 2 times the same chord progression, I can show it here with some colors, so we can look at it with this bluish color. So this section, it's exactly without any variation harmonically repeated right after. I'll put it with this other green. And that repetition is happening in such a way that it doesn't sound the same music. I mean, it sounds like a different variation. In fact, you can overlap and play the blue and the green at the same time. We can try that and it will work like this. So we'll have right? And it's combined. I mean, it's a masterful example of counterpoint where these two things tie together. Of course, there are some minor dissonances, but in of its own, these are perfectly overlapping progressions. So we have a repetition of this 2-5-1 of perfect cadence, perfect authentic cadence in D and D major. And that D major eventually becomes the dominant of G, and we're modulating. So what's the next part of this development is just this set of dominant and tonic, dominant and tonic, dominant and tonic. Just to explain it with the chords that we have here is dominant and tonic of A minor, dominant and tonic of E minor, and dominant and tonic of G. Right. So the simplest way to compress this would be to think of it as 5-1, or actually dominant tonic, because it's not a 5, it's a diminished chord of A minor. Then we have a dominant tonic of E minor, and then dominant and tonic of G major. So how do these keys work, and how do they make sense? Well, the way that they function and they give logic is through the concept of neighbor tones, in common tones. So if you're looking at it from this perspective, we're seeing A minor, which is the second degree. It's the relative key of the subdominant C major. If I'm in G major, the main keys are G major, subdominant C major, dominant D major, and tonic G major. So what I'm seeing is that the relative key of C major, which is A, is being used. Now I'm using a common tone E, which is part of A minor, to go to the next, right? And E minor is the relative of G major. So B is a common tone, and I'm getting back to G. Right, that's the chord progression. It's not a circle of fifths. It's like a quasi-sequential pattern, but as you can see, every time it's different. So it's not, this pattern is different from that one and from the following one. That type of constant change is really what makes the music beautiful and doesn't tire the ear, right? Now, when we go back to exposition 2, again, we are establishing this pattern. And the only remarkable change is this, apart from this secondary dominant that we pointed out, is that added scale, right? That scale that connects. Right, now we reach the transition 2. This is a much larger section, and I'd like to split it into different parts. So clearly there's a first phrase that goes up to this D that has a fermata sign. That fermata sign happens to be in bar 22, and the piece is 42 bars. So roughly speaking, it's almost at the end. I mean, if we were mathematically to have it on the end, it will have to be bar 21, but Bach is delaying it 2 beats. And then what we're seeing afterwards is this series of scales. But all of those scales, all they do is they are moving around the D major chord, the D. So we're basically standing on the dominant. And within that standing on the dominant, well, there is this part that's scalar and arpeggiated. And then there is this part which is based on pedal points, right? So they're kind of like the two developments. So the development for me, the transition has this opening phrase that basically all it does is point to where we're gonna arrive. It's gonna be the dominant. And from that point onward, everything is a build-up on the dominant, right? So let's see how we arrive to the dominant. It's through a very interesting device. It's this chromatic scale. We have C sharp, and then we reach the C natural, is the lowest note of the cello, right? And there are only 2 chords. So we have the dominant of the dominant, and here we have the dominant, right? And that dominant is, well, they're inverted. So this is a dominant 7th with the first inversion, where we were to write it like this, of dominant. And the next one is a dominant 7th in third inversion, exactly. So it's the last inversion, the C and the bass. And then he introduces back the C sharp that was happening here, kind of like a little connector. So this is what's happening. And after this point, well, we have 2 developments, as I said. So one is based on scales, and the other one is based on pedal points. Well, scales and arpeggios. We need to clarify this. So, and arpeggios. Harmonically, arpeggio or arpeggios. Harmonically, we're seeing that everything is basically D, right? D as being the primary point. I can highlight it. We have here D, that's D7. We arrive to E flat, that's the 9th. So it's like have D major chord, then it's D7, and then it's D7 flat 9. And after that flat 9, we go back to D7. Eventually, this 5 goes to 1. That's actually a different chord. So we have this one. Then that one is maintained. When we're seeing these C sharps, they should be thought as diminished chord of the dominant. Right? Then we're going to the dominant of the dominant. Here we have a little bit of that dominant. And from that point onward, as we can see, Bach is staying on the dominant, D major. That bar kind of resembles this. Right, that type of scale and arpeggio. So it's all G major scale and arpeggio. He realized that scalar motion to be distinct. So as you can see in the first half, the scales go up. We can point this out with maybe a red arrow, so we can see the scales ascending, moving upwards, and the arpeggios also are like pointing upwards. And then just to counteract this, you have the descending ones, which are happening there, but most prominently then Bach just decides to focus on the descending scale several times and does this type of sequence. Right? Usually when we're finding these descending sequences where something is taken a step down and each time is sounding a second lower, it's harmonized as a circle of fifths. So you might be finding C to right, so it's like C, G to C, F sharp to B, E to A, and so forth. In this case, as we don't have chords, all we see is these 7 notes going downwards. And from that point, Bach is playing with the pedal points, and these pedal points are essentially the open strings. So we have the open string A on A string, open string, which is the highest string of the cello. Cello has 4 strings, C, G, D, and A. And harmonically, that A has the function of the dominant of the dominant. So it's like a quite dissonant point. And after that, we go to the pedal point on D string, which is the dominant. And that pedal point basically remains as we saw it afterwards. So this is the pedal point. It's here. So probably I'll give it the green color, maybe a little bit of transparency. So that's the D. And before that, we were seeing the pedal point on A string, which is this one, right? This pedal point really reminds me of another piece by Bach, a very famous piece by Bach, the Toccata and Fugue in D minor, which, of course, some scholars are arguing that it's not by Bach and it might have some stylistic features that are not very common in the Bach works. And also the manuscript of that piece is a little bit obscure. But you can remember this very present passage with the pedal point 8, which is this. And we're hearing the same concept here. In reality, what Bach is doing, it's a series of scales. So if we look at the melody of its own, with ignoring the A, the melody is this. Right? That is the theme of invention number 1. If we can recall it. Right, so here Bach is self-quoting that theme. Right, and then he just stays with that last bit of it. Motivic fragmentation. Right, so I'll highlight the theme with orange maybe. Here we can see it. So, da, da, dun, da, 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 dun. And then that theme is restated with the ending, an echo. Then we have a second attempt of that. And a series of thirds that go downwards. After that, the pedal point on D, it's basically standing on a chromatic scale, chromatic ascending scale. And that's how Bach basically arrives to this climax, which is, well, the pinnacle point of this part. All right, so we now have seen this G major prelude and how Bach is composing with harmony. And now we'll be looking at my improvisation on that harmonic progression. So this is a piano transcription. As I said, well, this was the piece that I recorded on December 10 of 2022. Basically what I did here, and this was the second set of my Reinterpreting Baroque Music project, what I did is I took Bach's chord progression and I moved around it by trying to, well, arrive to a new texture. In this case, it's a light texture with a mid swing in eighth notes. And what we can see is, well, the same structure. So let's try to find the references. As you can recall, Bach had 3 expositions. So the first exposition is this one. right? The exposition as such is an extension of what Bach was doing, because in Bach's case, we were seeing only 4 measures, right? And each of these measures turns into a system of 4. So we're having an exposition that lasts 14 bars. As you can recall, in Bach's case, where we're seeing tonic, subdominant, dominant, and tonic, and respectively, I'm trying to do here, well, the tonic, the subdominant, the dominant, and the tonic. Right, so this would be the first development, or transition, first development, or transition. Why I call it a development and transition at the same time? Because transition as such has the goal of moving or modulating to another key, connecting to parts. In this case, maybe it might be more appropriate not to talk of transition, because what Bach is really doing is not to modulate or go from another place, but rather to do a development of an idea. So I'll retrade that term from here and from there to stay more accurate, and we'll keep calling these development 1 and 2. Right, so after this development, you can see I'm doing different things. We'll be listening to them now. I'm supposedly going back to the main theme again. So it's here. A while to find it. So here I'm going back to the same exposition. Right, it's an almost literal repetition. There are some minor variations, which we might comment after we overview the form. So we have again exposition 2, also in G major. And after that follows the second development. And the second development is a much longer one. I'm trying to replicate the fermata sign here. It's a little bit of a quote to Bach, and then we have those chromatic motions that are also similar to Bach. But the most literal repetition is, of course, that quote of the Invention number 1 by Bach. So that same Invention 1 quote is reappearing here. In Bach, we were hearing it here with swing. It sounds like this. Right, so that part is an almost identical quotation in the right hand of the melody. And after that, we have the little cadenza that retakes with the same concept of chromatic scale back to the exposition 3, the last one in G major. So that exposition is quite similar, and what I do in order to close the piece is to repeat the closing statement. So we have this. Broken cadence, and 2, 5, and 1, 4, 5, and 1. And for the first time, I'm quoting Bach's original theme, that pattern. Right, so here we have that Bach Suite 1 G major opening, which is used to close. And of course that interrupted cadence there is. Interrupted cadence is happening. So we're going from 5 to 6 if I were to play a perfect cadence, it would sound like this. But I'm doing interrupted, and it goes like that. So let's overview the theme and how I've composed and improvised back then in 2022 the harmonic on top of the harmonic progression of Bach, this piece. So the first thing that we notice is that there is this left hand that is trying to create a syncopated rhythm. We have the short, long, short, short, long rhythm, and it's used as an ostinato. So we have here the concept of ostinato, when a rhythmic pattern is being repeated throughout. If we keep scrolling, this is basically what you can see in the left hand happening all the time. And it's stopping here. So we're stopping the ostinato right at the fermata sign in the original piece by Bach. And then ostinato returns. This ostinato is maintained, and again, before the recap, we have this break of the ostinato, and ostinato is back. So the left hand in reality is not that complex texturally and rhythmically. It's staying most of the time the same, but and this is a good concept for composition students, is that try not to keep the left hand always doing the same, but even when you want to do something as limited as this piece, try to break every now and then the ostinato by stopping it, like I'm doing it here, or by doing a cadenza or some other accompaniment. So let's look now at the lines. Harmonically, the harmony is the same, so I won't be commenting too much on it. Of course, there are some extensions, so instead of doing G major, I'm having G major 7th, right? So that's like the first chord. The first chord is this G major 7th instead of the original G major by Bach. But well, what we can see is that this G major is really justified by the melodic direction that has that inner voice. And it's just the opposite direction of the melody. Right, so always try to think of these contrary motion counterpoints. Another good thing to keep in mind is the arpeggio that should be included in the theme. In this case, I went specifically for the 3 notes of the arpeggio going upwards. So we start with D, G, and B. And that motion of ascent continues. And then leads onto the D. So the melody is quite freely written. I mean, you can see that there is some logic to it because it goes upwards. Then we're trying to go downwards in the opposite direction. And after that, we have this closing idea. So basically, twice we can hear this opening idea and repeat variation of the opening idea. So this is the opening. And now we have the variation. Right. And what follows is a closing idea. So in order to provide some contrast, the closing idea has a different rhythm, and the rhythm is this dotted rhythm that happens at the beginning. So we have right, and it's based around the interval of the fifths. So we can see these descending fifths moving down, and the dotted rhythm is repeated afterwards. And in this last statement, well, the motion is parallel motion. Everything is descending, and it sounds much more conclusive because this time we arrive to G, which is the root of the tonality. So when you are creating a phrase that ends on G, on the root of the key, you're making a much more conclusive statement. In this case, you can notice how each ending is leaning on a different note of the chord. So this is the third of G major, and these two are the dominants of G major. So we're going there to the dominant of G major. So basically, all of the different options are presented. We have B, we have D, and finally we have G, which is making another beautiful arpeggio there. Right, development. So in order to make this development different, I divided it into two sections. Basically, the first one is based around that 2-5-1 in D major. So you can remember that there was this 2. Here we have the 5 and 1 in D major. And it was repeated again with 2, 5, and 1. So when improvising on top of that, I've tried to use parallel sixths, right? So the whole first part of the development is based on parallel sixths that build upon the 2-5-1 chord progression. Of G major. Of D major, sorry, it's D, the key that we're here. So this first part of the development is here. It sounds like this. And basically, when improvising this, I was trying to do a couple of things. Well, the first thing is, apart from thinking of the thirds and the chords, I've tried to think of contrary motion. So you can see how E goes to A, whereas all of this is descending. So we can see a beautiful contrast between the descending motion of the melody and the ascending motion of the bass. I'll try to highlight it here. We can see that A goes to E. Oh, that's the same A. E, sorry, goes to A. And then D goes to G, D goes to E. Sounds almost like this interrupted cadence. And the right hand is going opposite direction, it goes downwards, right? So we are seeing these two motions complement each other. Just want to stay consistent with the colors I was using in the other case, so I'll be using red for ascending scale and blue for the descending one, so we can see them better. And now that same motion is happening here. We're seeing that ascending line, and in the right hand we can see the descending line. Right? So those were basically the main things that I was trying to follow. And then, as you might know, well, my PhD dissertation is on silences and the use of silences in music. You can find it on Google and download it and read it. And one of the things that I try to do in my music is also to play with that concept of silence. So all across of this, we can see that there are these rhythmic pauses at the beginning, which are the syncopations, right? But also then we have longer pauses that are much more expressive, like these delays, or shorter pauses like these ones and here that are basically articulating the phrase. So we're having like a little comment or sigh. And I could have basically started on the downbeat, and it would sound like that, but I've purposefully tried to delay that and make sure that the listener already imagines hearing that sequence. imagines to hear that. So in order to play with that concept, I allow time to imagine that, and then we hear it. And as we know the descending scale already in our mind, because we heard it the first time, it's been omitted now. And that moves by contrary motion. Right, the contrary motion is also thought not just in here, but also in the other direction. So, for instance, this B goes up because the E goes down to C sharp. I try to go during the rest. I try purposely to go up. Same as here, that A goes up to this F sharp because the A in the left hand is going down to D. Everything is this set of contrary motion. So following this contrary motion that we can see in the first development, in the second part of the development, we had the diminished chords that were going on the key of A minor, E minor, and then the dominant to A, dominant to G major, right? So we had this, right? The equivalent is here. Back to G. So the equivalent of that is this improvisation. Right, and what is it based about? Well, this is the first time that we're hearing a more consistent flow of eighth notes, and they're combined also with these triplets. So the left hand is clearly this based on the harmonic progression. There's a little bit of direction into that because you can see how the D sharp is becoming an E, and then it goes to F sharp and then G. So it's this ascending scale. And it all begins with a C. So we have right, that ascending scale. And you might be wondering, like, well, I'm hearing augmented second intervals, and also there are augmented second intervals here. So these augmented seconds were purposely added in order to create this more exotic feel and more unstable that contrasts clearly with that transparency that we were seeing with the parallel six. So in the first half of the development, the set of descending six was dominating. Now we have a much more freer melody, which features these dissonant intervals. With offbeat syncopation, and it's basically made around two phrases. So we have this first phrase, and again I'm using the silence of that first note. So probably in order to not confuse the viewer with the colors, this should be blue. We'll put it back with the blue line. Right, that's not the blue. There it is. It goes there. D, C, D sharp, F sharp, G. And in the opposite green color here, we can see that those are the rests. So I was including these rests in order to delay, as was happening, by longer durations each time, the presentation of the melody. So we can see that first time it's just an eighth note. Then it's a beat. And now it's one beat and a half. And that returns back to the original theme. The melody is undulating a little bit like those forms that we were seeing in Bach. Right? that type of same type of undulation that goes up and down. So probably can keep the same colors there. Those are the descending lines, and then we have in red the ascending ones. They're all happening like in a very close distance, and you can see how every direction is kind of complementary. So first have ascend, then descend, ascend, descend. I'm missing actually this one and this one, right? But overall, the whole point is to stay in this area. It's not to move around, because if you can see the highest note, it's E. It's the same E that we can see here. So the range is quite limited, but expressively, the rests and also these triplets that I'm using here create a lot of contrast and diversity. After that, we go to Exposition 2, which is a very similar presentation of the events as was in section A. Right? So the first thing that is different is this G. We can see this added G that previously, wasn't there. We're just seeing this B. And after that, let's find. This was originally just, now it's more ornamented. So let's add these differences. Added note. Here we have ornamentation. Extended. Ornamentation extended. And then this part is quite similar, because we had whereas the second time it's right. So there's a rhythmic delay, a rhythmic anticipation, really, rather than delay, and we have this resolution. So had that little comment that now it's being removed. So the resolution is being simplified. Then the first time I was playing right, and that phrase now sounds right. So we're staying on the A. By doing this, there is no movement further into D, but the melody is like much more static. It stays on D. The original one was going with those 2/5. Now it's just one single fifth. And then the last part, we were seeing this. And this is being changed. Now it's so what we can see is this repetition of a descending scale, and this is a new motive. First presented on the beat, and then it's presented with an anticipation, right, which provides this little syncopation. After that, we are entering the second development. So the second development is happening here. And that's the equivalent of Bach's beginning of the development. You had this. And the pedal point is there on the D. So these 3 bars, and I'm actually quoting almost literally a little bit this idea that Bach has here, is now being played. Right, so this is like the first time that we're hearing a direct quote of Bach's Prelude. Well, direct quote, or actually modified, because it's a variation of that quote. The rhythm is slightly different, right? And after that, remember that there were two parts in the development. So one was consistent of the scales and the arpeggios, and the other one of pedal points. And I think in this case it's quite clear where begins one and when begins the other. So we start with the scales. Sorry. Right, and there's also a little bit of this quotation because there are two parts. There is this first part that doesn't have rhythm, so you have this block chords, and then the ostinato returns. The equivalent of this in Bach is this first part where you have this static movement of the harmony, and then the equivalent of the second part is those descending scales that we were pointing out. Right, so those descending scales become present here. Instead of doing 4 scales, this is a condensation. Only we have a condensation of just 2 scales. Whereas in Bach's it was 4. And also there's an expansion in the opening. So the opening exposition is an expansion of 4 bars into 16. Right? So this enlargement of those bars is what we're seeing there. Now, returning back to the condensation, harmonically, we're just staying on the dominant, doing this 5-to-1, what Bach was doing, and then that diminished chord, that's the dominant of the dominant, right? It's very interestingly voiced there. It looks like a modern chord of 2 seconds, and it's because it's a G sharp, E, the G is missing, it's appearing afterwards, and B flat, and that happens on top of D. So we can see it like this. And again, while I'm trying to bring out and ring this augmented second interval that we were seeing previously. So we can see this augmented second. The rest are also being each time longer, so we can see how the first time the music starts, well, on the down we have it with 1 offbeat, then we have it with 2 eighth notes, and then if we count further we have 3. Right, so that progression is kind of like delaying a little bit each time the way that the theme is appearing in the right hand. And once that's happening, the next part, it's this build-up. So in Bach's case, it's all connected, but in this piece, well, I've decided when improvising to split it. So if you remember correctly, we had A as a pedal point first. Right, the equivalent of that is here. That's almost a direct quote of the original with an added accompaniment. So this is a quote of Bach's suite. And then we have the cadenza. So this cadenza is the equivalent of the pedal point on D. When playing it live, I also like to add this little trill there. Right, and after that, it builds with the chromatic scale that we were seeing in Bach, right? So this chromatic scale. In Bach's case, the chromatic scale is here. is a much larger one. Here it's more condensed. Just a 6. And then we go back to the beginning. As happened with the second exposition, there are minor variations of the theme. So the more prominent ones are these delays that we're seeing with the silences that are kind of pushing a little bit the theme back and forth. But the main elements remain. So you have this opening and closing idea. By the way, when you have that, and I forgot to say that at the beginning, when you have an opening idea twice and a closing idea to end, this is what we call a sentence, right? So this is a sentence of 16 bars, which consists of 4 plus 4 plus 8. Or in this case, it's the opening idea, 4 of opening idea, 4 of opening idea again. And then this 8, which also could be seen as 4 plus 4 if needed. It's a little bit more connected with the closing idea, right? So if we move to the end, as I've said, there's this interrupted cadence. This is like the added harmony. Then we have the 2 as a subdominant, the 5 as the dominant, and back to the tonic 1. And harmonically that repeats again. So we have this 4, we've got this 4, sorry, that should have been written probably in bass clef because it's a low C and G and 5. So let me play this last part. Interrupted cadence, 2, and we have the B, and each time we have to go lower. But in this case, the direction is just the opposite, so it goes upwards. We can see this raising motion, and all it does is that all of these first cadences, they lead on the note B there twice, but then we're hearing the D and finally the G. So it's this arpeggio that leads into this triple octave ending with that goes with the G major. So this is basically what we can see in the improvisation that I did. Of course, if you want to hear it, you can go to my main YouTube channel where I have my music. It's youtube.com/Syroyid. So you can see how to spell it here, Syroyid. And there you can find different versions of this prelude played by me, some with the score, also others with the hand. Also, there is the audio. You can also find the audio on Spotify and in all different platforms in music stores. So without further ado, this is the end of the video. So I'd like to invite you to comment and share your ideas on the comment section. This is a slightly different format, as you can see. So we were doing a little bit of analysis, not so much in depth as we did with the previous examples, but we saw how this was used in an original improvisation and composition, in this case by me. So I'd like to hear from you, as I've said in the previous Brahms video, what is your musical background? Because it's really important for me to know if these videos are targeted at the right level, and if you're able to keep up and follow with all of the concepts that I'm explaining. And also I'd like to know, well, what are your musical interests? Because it's important for me to know also the type of music that you might want to see in these videos. If you would like to, well, study with me or have information in that, you can write a comment, and I'll provide you with the details on that. And I'd like to wish you a peaceful week, and I'll be seeing you in a week with some more music analysis and music composition studies. Have a good week. Bye.